I have occupied this bench for decades, and in that time, I have seen every iteration of human failing: greed, malice, pride, and the bottomless abyss of entitlement. But there are cases that settle into your bones, stories that defy the standard rhythm of a docket and demand to be remembered. This was one of those cases. It was a confrontation where the sheer arrogance of wealth collided with the quiet, unyielding gravity of service. It was the day a socialite learned that in my courtroom, a designer label is no shield against the truth. The morning began like any other, the air thick with the smell of old paper and the nervous hum of the gallery. When the doors finally swung open, the contrast between the two parties was so stark it was almost physical. First came the plaintiff, Thomas Miller. He walked with a heavy, deliberate step, his shoulders slightly rounded, not from weakness, but from the burden of things he had seen but would never speak of. He wore a simple suit, one that had clearly been pressed specifically for this appearance, but it lacked the sharp, aggressive tailoring of the modern elite. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the path before him, as if he were still navigating a minefield he couldn't quite escape. Then there was the defendant, Vanessa Sterling. She didn't walk, she drifted, accompanied by the distinct, frantic energy of someone who has never been told no in her life. She was draped in silk and gold, checking her reflection in her phone screen with a look of profound boredom. To her, this wasn't a legal proceeding, it was an inconvenience, a delay in a schedule she deemed far more important than the man standing 5 feet away from her. I watched her scan the courtroom, not with curiosity, but with the dismissive gaze of a predator who already considered the outcome settled in her favor. The file before me was a defamation and emotional distress claim. On paper, it sounded like a standard dispute, a falling out at an exclusive country club gala, but the reality, as I would soon uncover, was far darker. Vanessa Sterling hadn't just insulted Thomas Miller. She had systematically targeted him for his status as a disabled veteran, using his service as the punchline for her amusement in a room full of the city's social elite. She hadn't just bruised his ego, she had attempted to erase his dignity. I watched the interaction between them. When Thomas took his seat, he kept his hands folded, resting them on the table with a stillness that was unnerving. He was a man accustomed to waiting in the silence of high-stakes environments. Vanessa, by contrast, couldn't sit still. She was whispering to her counsel, her face twisted in a mocking sneer every time Thomas breathed. It was that sneer, that look of utter, casual superiority that warned me. This wasn't going to be about statutes or precedents. This was going to be an inquiry into the nature of humanity, and specifically, whether wealth gives a person the right to crush the spirit of a man who fought to protect it. The bailiff called the court to order, and for a heartbeat, the room went completely silent. I adjusted my robe, leaned forward, and looked directly at Vanessa. She didn't look back. She was busy adjusting a diamond bracelet. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but it told me everything I needed to know. She felt protected. She felt untouchable. She had no idea that in this room her status didn't exist. I tapped my gavel once, the sound sharp and final, cutting through the sterile silence of the chamber. The storm was about to break, and she wasn't ready for it. The prosecutor signaled for the first witness, an event organizer named Sarah Jenkins. As she approached the stand, she looked visibly uncomfortable, her eyes darting between the defense table and the jury. I signaled for her to sit. Her testimony would establish the foundation of the privileged display that defined the core of this conflict. Miss Jenkins, the prosecutor began, his voice steady. Can you walk us through the evening of the charity gala, specifically the segment where Mr. Miller was acknowledged? Sarah took a deep, shaky breath. It was meant to be a quiet moment of recognition. We were honoring local veterans. Thomas Miller was the last to speak. He didn't have a prepared speech. He just thanked the foundation and the guests for their generosity. He was humble, almost shy. He spoke about his time in service not as a highlight, but as a duty he was proud to have fulfilled. The room was attentive. It was respectful. She paused, looking toward Vanessa Sterling, who was aggressively checking her watch, seemingly bored by the recollection. And then, Sarah continued, her voice tightening, Miss Sterling decided it was time for her to be the center of attention again. She had been drinking, and she was loud. She didn't just interrupt. She projected. She shouted, loud enough for the entire ballroom to hear. Is this what we're calling entertainment now? A history lesson from someone who clearly didn't get the memo that the war is over? The courtroom remained deathly silent. That was the moment, the crime shock, the blatant, unprovoked assault on the dignity of a man who had earned his seat in that room 1,000 times over. I watched Vanessa as the testimony was read into the record. She was tapping her fingernails against the mahogany table, looking at the ceiling, completely unbothered by the gravity of what she had just done. It was the physical embodiment of the untouchable energy I mentioned earlier. She didn't see a human being. She saw a prop in her evening of entertainment. The prosecutor pressed further. And how did the room respond? Some were horrified, Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. Others, they laughed. They laughed because they were uncomfortable, and they laughed because they wanted to be on her side. They saw her wealth, her name, and they didn't want to risk being on the wrong side of the social divide. Thomas, he stopped speaking. He didn't defend himself. He just walked off the stage. I looked down at the court documents. That was the crux of the emotional distress. It wasn't just the words, it was the isolation. She hadn't just mocked him, she had turned the room against him, weaponizing the laughter of the crowd to silence his humanity. The entitlement was so thick it was suffocating. I saw Thomas sitting there staring at his hands. He wasn't crying, he wasn't shouting, he was enduring. That kind of patience is a testament to the character I am constantly looking for in my court. Vanessa finally shifted, offering a smirk to her attorney, as if she were waiting for the witness to be dismissed so she could get to her dinner reservation. She had no inkling that the room she was so accustomed to controlling was shrinking around her. The evidence was being laid out piece by piece, brick by brick, building a wall of accountability that she couldn't climb over with her pedigree or her bank account. She remained convinced that her reality, the one where she never faced consequences, would prevail. She was profoundly mistaken. I turned to the jury, observing their faces. The initial detachment was gone, replaced by a cold, sharpened focus. They were beginning to see her not as a socialite, but as a bully. The prosecutor stood, his face set in a grim, immovable line. Your Honor, we submit Exhibit B, compiled footage from the gala's security and attendee recordings. Vanessa's legal counsel jumped up, his objection already half-formed, attempting to cite privacy and context, but I waved him down with a sharp flick of my hand. The truth does not require a filter, and it certainly does not fear a grainy video file. The screen came to life. The audio was hauntingly crisp, the clinking of champagne glasses, the soft, rhythmic murmur of polite society, and then the jagged, cruel disruption of Vanessa's voice. It was deliberate. It wasn't just a rude comment made in passing, it was a calculated performance. She was holding court, demanding attention, and Thomas Miller was simply the target of opportunity. In the video, Thomas stood near the buffet, trying to remain inconspicuous, a man clearly uncomfortable in the grandeur of the setting, while Vanessa gestured toward him with a half-empty flute, her laughter rising above the jazz music. She was mimicking his gait, a low blow that hit the jury like a physical strike. I turned my eyes to Vanessa. On the screen, she was vibrant, laughing, and utterly devoid of empathy. In my courtroom, she was still, but her jaw was set. She wasn't looking at the screen, she was looking at the jury, waiting to see if they were as in on the joke as her peers had been at the gala. She had yet to realize that the rules here were written in a language she didn't speak. Accountability. Thomas didn't look at the screen. He kept his eyes fixed on the defense table, his expression unreadable. He had already lived this moment. He didn't need to watch it. But the jury, they were leaning in, their faces tight. One juror, a man with graying hair who looked like he'd seen enough of life to know when he was being lied to, let out a slow, sharp exhale. He was angry. The entire row of them was. Miss Sterling, I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings, I want you to look at that screen. Do you recognize the tone of your voice? She finally looked up, her expression a masterclass in feigned confusion. Your Honor, it was a joke. People were having a good time. It was a high-pressure gala environment. Surely the court understands that social settings are not depositions. Her arrogance was a tidal wave, crashing against the decorum of my court. She was attempting to dismiss the humanity of a man as mere social pressure. I gripped the edge of the bench, my knuckles white. It is a dangerous thing to assume that an insult becomes invisible just because it was delivered with a smile. She didn't see the damage she had caused. She only saw a reputation she needed to manage. This court is not a social club, Miss Sterling, I replied, the silence hanging heavy after my words. And in this room, we do not dismiss the character of an individual because of their social standing. You claim it was a joke, but a joke requires a willing audience, and I see no one laughing here today. The air in the room grew colder. For the first time, I saw a flicker, not of guilt, but of annoyance pass over her face. She was realizing that the social capital she had banked on was worthless here. The video continued to loop, her mocking laugh repeating, each cycle stripping away another layer of her polished, elite veneer. She was a woman who lived by optics, and the optics had suddenly turned against her. Her attorney, a man whose suit likely cost more than my first car, stood up with a practiced, oily smile. He wanted to talk about her charitable contributions. He wanted to bring in character witnesses, people with titles and substantial bank accounts to attest to her good heart. I let him talk for exactly 3 minutes before I had heard enough. "Mr. Henderson," I interrupted, my voice dropping an octave, a sure sign that the air in the room was about to leave his lungs. "I am not here to audit Miss Sterling's tax returns or count how many fundraisers she's hosted to buy her way into the society pages. We are here because she decided, in a moment of unbridled vanity, to act like a predator in a room full of people. Does her checkbook grant her immunity from basic human decency?" Vanessa bristled. She leaned into her microphone, the audacity etched onto her face. "Your Honor, you are blowing this out of proportion. It was a gala. It was loud. I was drinking." He looked so out of place. It was a joke. A simple, harmless joke. Why is this man even here? He clearly just wants a payout. The courtroom inhaled as one. The arrogance peak. There it was. She hadn't learned a single thing. She didn't apologize. She doubled down, blaming the victim's presence for her own lack of control and labeling his search for justice as a cash grab. I looked at Thomas Miller. He didn't flinch. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had heard it all before. The dismissals, the sneers, the assumption that because he walked with a limp, his voice held no weight. He was a veteran. He knew that silence was often the most powerful response to a fool. But I wasn't going to let this stand. "Miss Sterling," I said, leaning over the bench, "you are currently digging a hole so deep you'll never see sunlight again. You think because you move in circles where money papers over every crack, this court operates the same way. You are wrong. You call it a harmless joke. I call it a character flaw. And right now, that flaw is on full display." She looked at me, her mouth slightly agape, for once genuinely shocked that someone was actually speaking to her this way. She was used to being the loudest person in the room, the one who dictated the narrative. But here, the narrative was mine. She was the one in the hot seat, and the temperature was rising. I gestured for the prosecutor to continue. It was time to show the jury the receipts, not just of what she said, but of the calculated way she had tried to cover it up. The facade was cracking, but the real storm was yet to come. The momentum of the trial shifted in a way that I had only seen a handful of times in my career. The prosecutor, a man who clearly understood that facts are the only currency in this courtroom, didn't need to shout. He let the evidence speak for itself. He stood, retrieved a thin, unassuming manila folder from his table, and turned toward me. "Your Honor, we would like to submit Exhibit C, verified digital correspondence from a private group message exchange that took place less than 24 hours before the charity gala." Vanessa's attorney immediately shot up, his face reddening. "Objection. Irrelevant, prejudicial, and a violation of privacy." I didn't even wait for him to finish. Overruled. "Mr. Prosecutor, proceed." The courtroom became unnaturally quiet. This was the moment of evidence collapse. A technician synced the files to the projection screen. The message chain was displayed in high resolution. Vanessa's contact name, her profile picture, and the text she had sent to her inner circle. It wasn't the rambling of a person under the influence, nor the slip of a tongue. It was a cold, calculated strategy. "I'm going to make sure that old veteran is the highlight of my night," the text read. "Going to roast him so hard he'll think he's back in the trenches. It'll be the funniest thing anyone has seen in years." I looked at Vanessa. The mask, that impenetrable layer of expensive makeup and practiced boredom, didn't shatter, it dissolved. For the first time, her hands stopped moving. She wasn't checking her watch or her phone. She was staring at the screen, and for a fleeting second, the arrogance vanished, replaced by a raw, naked panic. She realized that the joke had been stripped of its context and revealed as a premeditated target. The jury's reaction was visceral. I watched a woman in the back row physically pull her chair away from the aisle, as if wanting to put distance between herself and the defendant. They weren't just judging her actions anymore, they were judging her character. The arrogance peak had officially crested and crashed. She had believed her status was a cloak of invisibility, but this digital footprint had dragged her into the harsh light of accountability. The prosecutor didn't stop there. He pulled up the metadata: time, date, location. There was no denying the authorship. "Miss Sterling," the prosecutor said, his voice cutting through the stillness like a knife, "is this your message?" She opened her mouth, but for the first time all day, no sound came out. Her attorney leaned in, whispering urgent, desperate instructions, but Vanessa was looking at the screen as if she were seeing her own undoing reflected there. The courtroom, which had been skeptical at the start, was now leaning forward, collectively waiting for her to answer. She was no longer the queen of the gala. She was a defendant, caught in the act of malice. I gripped my gavel. The case had transformed from a petty grievance into a moral reckoning, and the jury knew it. She had tried to turn a hero into a joke, but in doing so, she had turned herself into the lesson. Her attorney, sensing the walls of the courtroom closing in, made a final, desperate gamble. He called Vanessa Sterling to the stand. He clearly believed that if the jury could just hear her voice, if they could see the person behind the inflammatory text messages, they would be charmed by her social standing and her charisma. It was the ultimate miscalculation. Vanessa approached the stand with the practiced grace of someone who had spent her entire life being watched. She sat, adjusted her position, and cast a quick, calculated look at the jury, a smile that was meant to be disarming, but to anyone with a discerning eye, looked more like an invitation to join her in her disdain. "Miss Sterling," her lawyer began, his voice soft and coaxing, "these messages, they were private, weren't they? Taken out of context? You were among friends, letting off steam. You didn't mean to publicly ridicule Mr. Miller, did you?" Vanessa nodded, a perfect picture of wounded innocence. "Of course not. It was a private joke, nothing more. We were at a gala. It was a high-stress environment, and, well, Mr. Miller was simply not part of our circle. I never intended for him to hear it. It's truly unfortunate that people choose to take things so personally." I felt the temperature in the courtroom drop. It wasn't an apology. It was a justification. The arrogance peak had been reached. She was implying that because Thomas Miller wasn't in her social stratum, his feelings were irrelevant. She was essentially saying that her lack of empathy was a symptom of his inadequacy, not her cruelty. I watched Thomas Miller. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at the jury. He simply stared at the table, his shoulders tight. I saw his hand twitch just once before he clenched it into a fist. He was a man who had faced true adversity, and here he was, being patronized by a woman who wouldn't know a hardship if it hit her in the face. "Miss Sterling," I interjected, the silence broken by the sharpness of my tone. "Are you implying that the public nature of your commentary at a community event, mind you, is negated by the fact that you didn't think he was part of your circle?" She turned to me, and for a moment, the mask slipped. "Your Honor, I'm just saying that in my world, we have a certain humor. It's not meant to be analyzed in a courtroom. In this world," I shot back, leaning into the microphone, "and specifically in this courtroom, we call that harassment. You seem to think your privilege acts as a filter, allowing you to choose who is worthy of respect and who is merely a prop for your amusement. You are wrong." The jury was no longer listening to her defense. They were listening to her indictment of herself. Each word she uttered was a nail in her coffin. She had spent her life believing that her status meant she could look down on others, but under the scrutiny of the truth, she looked small, petty, and undeniably guilty. She was trying to charm a room that had already decided she was a villain. And the worst part? She still didn't realize it. She kept speaking, convinced that if she just used enough words, if she just sounded enough like the person she wanted to be, we would all fall for it. The atmosphere in the courtroom reached a suffocating intensity when the heavy oak doors opened once more. It was Arthur Sterling, Vanessa's father, a titan of industry, a man whose name alone usually caused judges to adjust their posture and bailiffs to straighten their ties. He didn't enter with his usual entourage of handlers or PR fixers. He walked alone, his shoulders slumped under the weight of an obvious, crushing realization. He had watched the proceedings from the back of the room. He had witnessed the video evidence, the testimony, and the cold, unrepentant nature of his daughter's arrogance. He approached the stand, not as a character witness for the defense, but as a man who had finally seen the precipice he was standing on. Vanessa sat up, her eyes lighting up with a flicker of desperate hope. She still believed, right up to that second, that his arrival was the cavalry, that his name would be the shield that would deflect the judgment of the court. She leaned forward, mouthing words of reassurance to him, clinging to the toxic belief that their family power was an absolute force. But Arthur didn't look at her. He looked at me, then at the jury, and finally, he let his gaze rest on Thomas Miller. He looked like a man who had spent 40 years building a dynasty, only to realize he had built it on shifting sand. "Your Honor," he said, his voice raspy, stripped of the booming authority he was known for in the boardroom. "I have spent my entire life teaching my daughter that our name was a legacy to be protected. I thought I was teaching her strength. I realize now, watching this, I was teaching her that she was untouchable." The room went deathly still. This was the moment the privilege truly collapsed, not by my ruling, but by the shattering of her own support system. He looked at Vanessa, who was now trembling, her face drained of all color. He didn't offer a smile. He didn't offer a defense. He simply shook his head. "I have seen the evidence today," Arthur continued, his voice steadying with a painful resolve, "and I cannot stand here and ask for mercy for behavior that I do not recognize as my own. I taught her to value success, but I failed to teach her to value people." He turned to Thomas Miller. "Sir, I cannot undo the humiliation my daughter caused, but I will not stand in the way of this court. I will not shield her from the consequences of her own choices." He didn't ask for a settlement. He didn't try to negotiate. He simply walked away from his daughter's defense and took his seat in the gallery. That was the true collapse. Vanessa looked as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. Her shield, her name, her leverage, it was all gone, discarded by the very person who had given it to her. The jury didn't need to hear another word. They had seen the final piece of the puzzle, a woman who had run out of people to hide behind. The jury returned with their verdict within the hour, a testament to the chilling clarity of the evidence presented. They found Vanessa Sterling liable for defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. There was no hesitation in their decision. They didn't just see a spoiled woman. They saw someone who had weaponized her status to dehumanize a man who had sacrificed for the very society she treated as her playground. I watched as the foreman read the verdict. The courtroom, which had been so loud with the echoes of Vanessa's laughter only days before, was deathly still. When the final word was spoken, Vanessa didn't scream, and she didn't cry. She simply collapsed into her chair, the weight of the moment finally pinning her down. Her father, Arthur Sterling, stood in the back of the gallery, his face unreadable, his pride in his daughter's status long since replaced by a grim acceptance of her character. I had the final word. I leaned forward, looking not at the gallery, but directly at Vanessa. "In this courtroom, Miss Sterling, you learned a lesson that money cannot buy and influence cannot erase, that dignity is not a commodity to be traded or mocked. You thought your name and your pedigree were shields against the consequences of your cruelty. You were wrong. A uniform does not merely denote service. It denotes a sacrifice that you couldn't comprehend if you tried. Today, you are being held accountable not for your status, but for your soul. I ordered the damages to be paid in full to a veterans charity of Thomas Miller's choosing. It was the only way to ensure that Vanessa's arrogance was transformed into something meaningful. As the courtroom cleared, I watched Thomas Miller rise. He didn't pump his fist in the air. He didn't gloat. He simply straightened his jacket and walked toward the exit with that same steady, measured pace he had arrived with. As he passed the defense table, he stopped. He looked at Vanessa for a long moment. There was no hatred in his eyes, only a profound, weary pity. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He had his closure, and more importantly, he had his dignity back. Vanessa remained seated long after the bailiff cleared the room, staring at the empty witness stand. She had walked in here as an untouchable titan of society, believing that the world bowed to her whims. She left as a reminder of what happens when power is stripped of character. It was a somber conclusion to a case that I will carry with me for the rest of my days. Justice isn't just about the verdict, it's about the truth. And in this courtroom, the truth was the only thing that survived the storm.